Boldwood presents Starry Skies Over Primrose Hall, written by Jill Steeples and read by Karen Cass. The moral right of the author has been asserted. This performance is owned by Boldwood. Chapter 1. The old barn in the grounds of Primrose Hall had never looked prettier than on that late summer afternoon. Recent renovations had seen the brickwork repointed, the structural beams restored to their former glory, and a new rosewood floor fitted. With the double doors opened out onto the gardens, allowing the scent of meadows and summer blooms to waft inside, the light and airy building had been transformed into a romantic oasis. Along with spiralling foliage, intertwined with fairy lights, swathes of gold ribbons hung from the rafters, complementing the dark cream of the walls, the light oak beams, and the soft hue of the red bricks. Long trestle tables were adorned with gold-flecked linen runners, and jam jars were filled with white roses and gypsophila, creating a rustic and charming ambience. Pia sat back in her seat, took a sip from the champagne flute in her hand, and allowed herself a smile of satisfaction. All the hard work had paid off, and she was delighted for her best friend Abby and Sam, whose special day it was. Pia shuffled her chair up nearer to Jackson, who rested a casual arm around her shoulder and leant down to whisper in her ear. "Have I told you? You look absolutely beautiful today." Pia laughed and shrugged away a shiver at the sensation of his breath upon her neck. He had, several times in fact, not that she would ever grow tired of hearing him telling her those words. She cast a glance over his relaxed body, reclined on the seat, thinking he looked pretty good himself in a French blue silk suit that accentuated his natural masculine grace. Dragging her gaze away from Jackson, her attention was distracted by a flurry of activity further along the main table, where Sam Finnegan got to his feet, a bemused smile on his face. He looked suitably dashing and handsome, too, in a soft grey three-piece suit, his pristine white shirt open at the collar, shirt sleeves rolled up, his tie long since abandoned. He paused a few moments, soaking up the warm ripple of goodwill and laughter that radiated in his direction from the gathering of guests in the room. "Well, hey, look, I'm as surprised as anyone that I'm actually standing here today." A smile played on his lips, and his eyes sparkled in amusement. "Anyone who knows me, and I'm including all you good people in front of me, will know that I'm not... Honestly, I couldn't be any happier." Sam reached out a hand to thread his fingers through his bride's. "Meeting Abby was the best thing to ever happen to me. It was something I never expected. When I first set eyes on her, sitting on the bench, not too far away from here, actually, over in Primrose Woods, I knew I simply had to go and talk to her." Abby looked up at Sam, her love for her new husband evident to see in her expression. "Although I have to say, Abby seemed much more enamoured with my dog Lady than she was with me on that first meeting, and to this day, I still believe that if my new wife were to have favourites in our household, then I wouldn't be at the top of the list." "It's not true." Abby threw back her head and laughed, before looking over her shoulder at the assembled audience with a grimace, as though it might actually be true. For a moment, everyone's attention was diverted towards one of the guests' tables where Sam's work colleagues, fellow park rangers from Primrose Woods Country Park, were seated. They had the responsibility of looking after Lady, the Springer Spaniel, who, in fairness, must have realised the auspiciousness of the occasion because she'd been on her best behaviour throughout the wedding ceremony and was now sitting contentedly by the table, alert to any titbits that might be in the offing. For once, her liver and white coat was gleaming clean, with no sign of the usual muddy paws and grey tinge to her fur that came from spending the best part of her day outside in the elements, scrabbling around in the undergrowth. A white bandana printed with red hearts was tied around her collar, which made her look even more adorable than usual, even if no one would have believed that was possible. "Don't worry, I'm not one for long speeches," Sam went on, "so I will keep this short. But I do have to say a few heartfelt thank yous, firstly and most importantly to my wonderful bride
for agreeing to be my wife in the first place."
A collective sigh of sentiment wafted around the room, along with a few whoops from the Rangers table.
"I am so lucky and grateful that I get to share the rest of my life with you."
He shook his head, as though he still couldn't quite believe it.
"To Bill, thank you for entrusting me with your daughter. I know that my feelings for Abby are only matched by your own, and I promise I will do everything within my power to make her happy. What I could never have anticipated when I got together with Abby was finding a real and genuine friendship with you. We clicked from the start."
Bill pressed his lips together and nodded his agreement.
"You're my walking buddy, my drinking pal, fellow member of the Primrose Woods quiz team, a wise counsel, as well now as my father-in-law."
Abby dropped her head on her dad's shoulder, and if you were to get close enough, you might have noticed the emotion brimming in both their eyes.
"Lizzie, what can I possibly say?"
Lizzie Baker, wearing a fetching, floaty chiffon dress in shades of lilac, was sitting on the other side to Bill, their hands gently interlocked beneath the table.
"I simply don't have the time here to express my gratitude for your friendship and support from the moment I first arrived at Primrose Woods. Walking into the Treetops Cafe on my first day, you greeted me with that gorgeous sunny smile of yours, urged me to try one of your bacon butties, handed me a cappuccino, insisted it was on the house, and you've been looking out for me ever since."
Lizzie smiled and blushed. She'd recognised a kindred spirit in Sam. They had both been emotionally vulnerable and out of sorts at the time. Lizzie because she'd recently lost her beloved husband, David. Then her only daughter, Katie, had moved to the other side of the world shortly afterwards, and Lizzie had been left to work through her feelings of grief and isolation alone. Sam had gone through a similarly dark period, as his best friend and girlfriend had fallen in love and run off together, just before his beloved mum had died far too prematurely from cancer. Arriving at Primrose Woods, Sam had been determined to make a new start, and Lizzie's constant and friendly presence in his new daily routine had been a big help in making the transition.
"Lizzie won't mind me telling you that she always showed," he paused over his choice of word, "what you might call a zealous interest in my love life, and was hopeful of marrying me off to someone."
"Anyone," said Lizzie with a shrug, which was met with much laughter from the guests.
"It was just my luck that Abby and Bill were having lunch at Lizzie's place when I was replacing some fence panels in the garden. I recognised Abby as the woman I'd chatted to in Primrose Woods, and when Lizzie invited me to join them for lunch, well, I wasn't going to let that opportunity pass."
A wide smile spread across his face at the memory.
"It must have been fate, because the rest, as they say, is history. Abby, Bill and Lizzie, together with Luke and Ree," he gestured towards a good-looking young couple on a nearby table, "you became the family that I'd always been looking for. I found my tribe with you guys."
He took a breath, the emotion of the occasion clearly threatening to overwhelm him.
"Anyway, thanks to you all, from the both of us, for coming and joining us in this celebration and for making our wedding day even more special than we could ever have imagined it to be. Finally," he said, just stopping the guests as they were about to break into a round of applause, "I have to give a huge thanks and to his hugely efficient assistant, Pia, Abby's great friend from school, for stepping in when our original venue, the village hall, was closed. They very generously invited us to hold our wedding here in this amazing barn, and honestly, there could be no more fitting venue. Primrose Woods is our happy place, a beautiful backdrop to where we first met, so it will always hold a special place in our hearts. To be able to have our reception here really is the icing on the cake. Thank you, Jackson and Pia, and to all of you for sharing this wonderful day with us. Now come on," he said, holding up his champagne glass to the room. "Let's get this party really started."
With the speeches over, the guests started scattering, mooching around to stretch their legs and chat to fellow guests, while music began playing through the sound system. Jackson turned to Pia and took her face in his hands, tidying the escaping strands of hair from her French plait.
"Hey, let me see you. You've not been crying, have you?
Jackson's brow furrowed. No? Pia batted his hands away playfully. Well, maybe, she said with half a smile as she widened her eyes to hold back her emotion. Jackson reached for the pink silk pocket square from his suit jacket.
See, I knew this would come in handy today,
he said, handing it over gallantly. Thank you. It almost seems too luxurious to use. Pia ran the silky fabric through her fingers.
No, you go right ahead.
It was a lovely speech from Sam, wasn't it? Pia dabbed at her eyes with the cloth. I'm so happy for them both. After everything that Abby went through with her ex, she deserves her happiness. They both do. They're so lucky to have found each other. A match made in the stars, don't you think?
If you say so,
said Jackson, with his customary touch of cynicism. He leant across to kiss her, and Pia's eyes fluttered close in anticipation as she awaited the touch of his mouth upon hers.
What are you two lovebirds up to? Looks like the romance of the occasion's got to you. I can understand why.
Pia and Jackson's moment of intimacy was interrupted before it had even started by the arrival of Declan Ashby, one of Sam's fellow rangers from Primrose Woods, who rested a hand on each of their shoulders. He had a big grin on his face as he spoke.
It'll be you two next, tying the knot, I don't doubt. Well, remember me when you draw up the invitation list, won't you?
Pia laughed awkwardly, while Jackson rolled his eyes exaggeratedly and gave a firm shake of his head. Hey! Pia elbowed Jackson in the ribs in mock outrage, feeling the slight all the same.
Don't worry, love, Declan said, laughing.
The shake of the head even more emphatic this time.
Why spoil a decent relationship by getting married? Although perhaps best to keep that to ourselves on a day like today.
Jackson held a finger to his mouth before that familiar, seductive half-smile returned to his lips, while Pia's grin grew ever more fixed, determined as she was not to give away her true feelings. Declan had been right about one thing. Pia had lapped up every bit of the emotional intensity of the day. Who wouldn't? Well, apart from Jackson, that is. It wasn't the first time he'd made clear his views on marriage, although she hoped he might have come up with a better way to describe their relationship other than decent. Pia and Jackson were happy together. Wasn't that the most important thing of all? Even if she was beginning to realize that their individual long-term plans, their hopes and dreams for the future, might be very different indeed. Chapter 2. After the celebrations of the previous day, which went on into the early hours, when Jackson and Pia had danced their legs off and drunk far too many glasses of champagne, Sunday morning rolled in at a leisurely pace at Primrose Hall. After a reviving mug of coffee first thing, Jackson had hopped on his motorbike on the pretext of collecting the papers from the village shop, although Pia knew it was the perfect excuse for him to take the scenic route around the country lanes, enjoying the freedom and exhilaration that came from navigating the twists and bends of the open road. She couldn't help worrying, especially when it had been a motorbike accident as a teenager that had been the catalyst for him leaving the village and not returning until several years later. To take her mind off what Jackson might be doing, Pia gave in to the insistent demands of Bertie the Dalmatian and headed outdoors for a walk around the grounds of Primrose Hall, a favourite part of the day for both of them. It was the last weekend in August, and the gloriously sunny weather of the past few weeks showed no sign of lifting, the sun warm and caressive on her bare arms. The gardens, filled with the scents of the vast array of blooms, expertly tended by Matteo, were at their finest, their colours painting the landscape with their beauty. There wasn't a day that went past when she didn't pinch herself that she'd got to call this place home. Although it was only 6 months since Pia had arrived at Primrose Hall, employed as a personal assistant to Jackson, in some ways it seemed much longer. They'd had such a busy summer overseeing the hall's busy social calendar. There'd been the monthly craft days at the stables, the inaugural and very successful classic car show in the grounds, and a couple of weddings too, one for Abby and Sam, and the other for Pia's brother Connor earlier in the summer. To think that she'd almost turned down Jackson's job offer, not wanting to work for the man who had broken her heart when she was still a teenager. Back then, she'd believed Jackson was as madly in love with her as she had been with him. So she was left devastated when he simply upped and left the village without so much as an explanation. He didn't even say goodbye. When he returned 10 years later, as the new owner of the recently restored and renovated Primrose Hall, Pia experienced a rush of emotions: excitement, curiosity, and anger, but mostly anger. How dare he turn up after all that time without making any mention of their previous relationship or giving any apology? Instead, he'd had the audacity to offer her a job when she attended an interview held at the Treetops Cafe in Primrose Woods. She'd barely been able to make sense of Jackson's sudden reappearance in the village and was adamant that she would have nothing further to do with him. But her good intentions didn't last long. She'd quickly had to put her principles to one side. With the sale of her late parents' home going through and facing a future without anywhere to live or a job on the horizon, Pia couldn't sensibly turn down Jackson's offer of a well-paid job with live-in accommodation. She'd decided it would work as a temporary solution until something better came along. Now she didn't have any regrets about making the decision to come and live at Primrose Hall. She'd quickly settled into her new role and been made to feel very welcome by the whole team. Not only Jackson, but Matteo the gardener, Ivy the housekeeper, and Frank the maintenance man, who all worked together towards the upkeep of the house and in the running of the events at the hall. The fact that she and Jackson had resolved their differences and rekindled their teenage romance had only added to the appeal of life at the hall, even if it had made life a tad more complicated. "Come on, Bertie," she called, hearing the familiar and reassuring rumble of Jackson's motorbike returning. "We should get back. Time for breakfast." As she approached the back door to the kitchen, she heard chatter coming from inside. She smiled, recognizing Jackson's mum Ronnie's distinctive and engaging voice ringing out. "So how did it go, Jackson? I saw you all lining up in front of the barn for the photos. It looked wonderful." Ronnie had been desperate to hear all about the wedding, and with her impeccable sense of timing, seemed to know precisely when breakfast was in the offing. Pia slipped off her trainers in the boot room, still listening in on Jackson and Ronnie's conversation.
"Yep, it was a great day. It all went off without any hitches," he said. "Everyone seemed to have a great time, and we had some good feedback about the barn."
"I bet Pia was pleased. I know that she really wanted to make it special for her friend."
Oh, Pia was in her element. She loved every moment of it. She's such a romantic. There were a few tears shed, although none from me, I hasten to add.
Jackson gave a low chuckle. "Oh, I bet. She wears her heart on her sleeve, that one. You know, you need to be careful not to break that girl's heart. I don't think any of us would ever forgive you if you did."
"What'd you take me for?"
Jackson gave Ronnie a sharp glance, while there was a bemused smile from Pia, still craning an ear from the boot room. She would have to go inside soon, or else she might hear something she'd really rather not. Although there was no need for Ronnie to worry on her behalf. Pia had had her heart broken once before by Jackson. There was absolutely no chance she would let it happen for a second time. "I thought I heard voices," said Pia, pushing through the kitchen door, with Bertie barging her out of the way so that he could get through first to say hello. Jackson had made a start on cooking breakfast, which had become a regular part of their Sunday routine ever since their relationship had changed from purely professional into something more intimate. Pia would always offer to help, but Jackson would wave a hand and tell her to sit back and relax, which she didn't need telling twice. She loved to watch him move around the large country kitchen so effortlessly, clearly relaxed and happy in his role as head chef. The aromas of coffee and cooking bacon wafted in the air, greeting her nostrils. Pia fetched some orange juice from the fridge and sat down at the kitchen table opposite Ronnie. "Jackson was just telling me all about the wedding. I hear it was a good day." "It was simply perfect. Everything about it. The service, the food, the weather. Abby looked beautiful in her dress, didn't she, Jackson? Pia went on, not waiting for Jackson's reply. It was a very simple shift design in cream satin, but the effect was stunning. I've got so many photos I need to show you. Pia sighed as the memories of the day assaulted her. Memories that would stay with her forever.
Pia was a hot mess all day long,
Jackson teased. I was not, she said indignantly.
You were. Every time I looked at you, there were tears in your eyes and a big soppy grin on your face.
Pia shrugged and helped herself to a piece of fruit from the wicker basket. She peeled back the skin of the banana and took a decisive bite. I couldn't help it. It was a very emotional occasion. Weddings always affect me that way. She fanned a hand in front of her face. Ronnie smiled and took a sip from her mug of coffee, enjoying hearing. So does this mean we'll be seeing more weddings at the hall? Ronnie asked, with half a smile on her lips, as she exchanged a glance with Pia, suspecting she already knew the answer to her question. I should imagine it could be a real money spinner.
It's not about the money. Jackson gave Ronnie a withering glance. Besides, we've got so many other plans for the hall. We want to run events that will benefit the whole community, similar to the classic car show we held in the summer.
I must admit that was good fun, Ronnie said.
Pia's book festival is coming up next month. Then it will be our first bonfire extravaganza night, and before we know it, it will be Christmas carols in the courtyard. Plus there's the regular craft fairs over in the stables. We simply don't have the time or the resources to make this a dedicated wedding venue. Besides, I don't want this place overrun by drunk revellers every weekend. Primarily, this is my home, our home. He corrected himself, laying a hand on Pia's shoulder as he served the plates filled with sausages, bacon, mushrooms, hash browns, tomatoes, fried eggs, and beans. And we all need to be happy in what we're doing here. I don't want the running of the hall to become a chore, and I think it might if we had a succession of wedding parties.
Pia looked up into Jackson's face, appreciating his effort to make her feel that this was as much her home as it was his. But despite their closeness and the fact that she'd moved from her own self-contained apartment within the hall into the grandeur of the master bedroom in recent weeks, she was aware that she had no real security to speak of. After all, only a few months before Pia had arrived at Primrose Hall, Jackson had been in another relationship with an impossibly glamorous interior designer called Tara. That relationship had faltered, and Tara had vacated the hall, nursing a broken heart. Would her own relationship with Jackson become just as dispensable one day? Fair enough. Ronnie helped herself to a slice of granary toast from the basket on the table, breaking into Pia's thoughts. As long as I'll still be allowed to have my wedding here one day, then that's all that matters to me, she said airily. Jackson shook his head indulgently.
And which poor chump do you have in mind for the role as leading man? Just so we know and are suitably prepared.
Ronnie pressed her lips together and lifted her chin, sweeping her head to one side in a show of defiance. I'm not sure yet, but I remain hopeful. Once you give up on the idea of love, you might as well give up on life itself.
Well, I certainly admire your optimism, said Jackson.
What was your wedding to Rex like? Asked Pia. Was it a big do? Seeing Ronnie roll her eyes and hearing the accompanying snort of derision, Pia wondered what had possessed her to ask such a question when she... Well, of course, we didn't have any money, so it was all done on a shoestring, and it was a bit last minute. There were only about 15 of us, our families and a few friends. It was at the registry office in town, and we didn't book a reception. We couldn't afford to, so we just went on a pub crawl afterwards, ending up at the Three Feathers in Wishwell. I think there might have been some sandwiches and cake, but that was about it. Of course, Rex was absolutely rat-arsed, and that was before he'd even got to the ceremony. I suppose you could say that it set the entire tone for our marriage. Mind you, I think we were probably as bad as each other. She paused a moment, her fork in the air, lost in her thoughts. It all seems like such a long time ago now.
That's because it was a long time ago, Jackson said gruffly, displaying his customary lack of sentimentality.
And that's why you've always been so anti-marriage, no doubt. Ronnie gave a small chuckle. You didn't have a very good example in me and your father.
Jackson tilted his head to one side and scrunched his mouth in thought. I'm not anti-marriage at all. I think it's a great institution. For other people, if they think they can make it work, then great. It's just not for me. He shrugged his shoulders in that infuriating way of his that brooked no argument. Pia was receiving the message loud and clear. That was twice in 2 days Jackson had mentioned in no uncertain terms where he stood on that particular subject. He obviously didn't want her getting any funny ideas on that front. Now she focused on her breakfast. It was delicious, but the turn in the conversation had taken the edge off her appetite. She might have agreed with Jackson's point of view a while ago. She hadn't given marriage a second thought then. There'd been no reason to, when her whole focus during her 20s had been caring for her parents. Boyfriends, marriage, and babies were something to consider much further into the future. There'd been the occasional date, but nothing that had materialised into anything more. It was only when her mum passed away, and she and Connor had to sell the family home, that Pia was forced to contemplate what she wanted from her future. The job at Primrose Hall had been a lifeline, but was only ever intended as a stopgap. She hadn't anticipated settling in so easily, forging close relationships with the rest of the team, and finding so much more than just a place to live and work. Primrose Hall had become home to Pia and Bertie. More than that, though, Jackson Moody had got beneath her skin and, despite her best intentions, she'd fallen for his charms again, just as she had when she was a teenager. Now she couldn't imagine any kind of future without him in it. Her thoughts had strayed towards all those big milestones in life only because her brother and her best friend had recently married. It was only natural to compare yourself with those around you. Pia felt she had a lot of catching up to do, in life and in love, making up for all those lost years, but she was in no hurry to take those next steps. Not yet, but definitely one day. It wasn't as if her biological clock was clanging in her ear, rather it was whispering gently sometimes when she was least expecting it. Talk of the devil? Jackson glanced at his phone on the table beside him. Dad's on his way down. I wish he wouldn't get a taxi. I've told him before that I'm more than happy to go and collect him on the bike.
I wonder what he wants, and on a Sunday morning too, Ronnie grumbled. I knew this would happen as soon as he arrived back in the village, making a nuisance of himself, turning up whenever the fancy takes him.
He's not making a nuisance of himself. He's always welcome here, said Jackson firmly. At any time. As you are, he said, softening his words with a smile.
But I live here, Ronnie protested.
You live in a clapped-out old van in the grounds of the house. Why, when there's your pick of several bedrooms in this house, I will never know, but I'm happy to tolerate your whims, and you coming and going whenever you like. It's only natural, though, that I would extend the same courtesy to Dad.
Huh. Ronnie pushed her finished plate away, then crossed her arms in front of her chest.
Anyway, I thought you and Dad were good these days. The pair of you seemed to be getting on like a house on fire the last time he was here.
Jackson glanced at Pia, who bit on her lip, trying not to smile. It was obvious that Ronnie still had feelings for Rex by the way she acted around him, becoming all giggly and flirtatious in his presence. Pia had joked with Jackson that she could see the pair of them getting back together. The very idea had horrified Jackson. He couldn't deal with the drama that came with Rex and Ronnie being in the same room together for any length of time. Well, obviously I try to rub along with Rex, for your benefit mainly, my darling, Ronnie said disingenuously as she reached across and touched her son's arm. But honestly, your father is as flaky as he ever was. She exhaled a sigh. I'm not sure why I expected he might have changed in the intervening years, but he hasn't. We'd planned to take a day trip to the coast this week. It was even Rex's idea, but he called off at the last moment. Just like the good old days, she said with a humourless laugh.
Well, he'll be here shortly. You can ask him about it. I'm sure there must be a reasonable explanation.
There always is and there always was, said Ronnie wearily. He has all, she said, feigning nonchalance. I won't be jumping through hoops for that man any more, that's for sure. Right, well, I ought to go and get myself ready for the day, she said, running a hand through her silvery hair and forcing a smile. Thanks for breakfast. She pushed back her chair and stood up. It was delicious. See you later, Pia called, feeling a pang of sympathy for Ronnie as she watched her leave the room. Despite Ronnie's assertion that Rex was of little importance to her these days, Pia knew her better than that. Ronnie had once confided that Rex, despite all his shortcomings, had been the love of her life, even if their relationship had been brief and tumultuous. His reappearance in the village after several years' absence, living in Spain, had stirred up a whole pot of emotions. Jackson's shock had quickly been replaced by gratitude that he'd been given the chance to rebuild a relationship with his father, who had been mainly missing during his childhood years. For Ronnie, though, it had brought up a whole raft of different feelings, guilt and regret over what might have been. Pia recognised Ronnie's vulnerability and sensitivity where Rex was concerned. She recognised it because it was the exact same way that she felt towards Jackson. Chapter 3. Ree and Luke took their drinks and sat down at the table in the bay window of the Three Feathers, the sun's rays warming their backs. Ree rested her arm along the edge of the seat and exhaled a sigh of contentment. Hasn't this been the best weekend ever? It's been great, said Luke, picking up his glass of lime and soda and taking a hearty glug. Ree's gaze drifted around the bar as she soaked up the atmosphere of the popular village pub. It was busy with afternoon revellers, enjoying a pint of beer or a glass of wine before returning home for their Sunday dinner. The chatter and laughter of those customers making the most of the glorious weather wafted in from the beer garden. It's good to be back. Ree and Luke had travelled down on Friday night, staying with their respective families ahead of Abby and Sam's wedding on the Saturday. They'd managed to cram so much into the weekend, catching up with friends and old work colleagues and relishing yesterday's celebrations. Ree was still riding high on a wave of adrenaline. This morning they'd visited Primrose Woods, the location of many of their meetups before they'd become a couple. They'd walked along the Woodpecker Trail, hand in hand, revisiting their favourite spots, the bench beside the lake and the rickety bridge over the stream, stopping to take some selfies as the late summer sunshine cast a golden glow through the trees. Then it was just like old times. Now, before they started on the journey back to Dashford-upon-Avon, Ree had insisted on making a flying visit to the pub to see her old bosses, Malk and Jan. From the moment Ree had walked through the front door, it was like being wrapped in a warm hug. Hello, sweetheart. Jerry, one of the pub's regulars, had been standing at his usual spot, propping up the bar, and it was as if Ree had never been away. He'd turned to embrace her in a bear hug. Are we going to see you back behind the bar here soon? We've all missed you, you know. I'm afraid not, Ree had said with a frown. We're only down for the weekend. But I couldn't pass up the chance to pop in to see how everyone's doing. I've already told her, Jan had said, as she poured a glass of wine for Ree and a soft drink for Luke, which Jerry insisted on paying for. There'll always be a job here for Ree if she wants one. Ree had beamed, happy to be back amongst her old friends. This place was special to her because it had been a safe and welcoming environment at a time when she was at her lowest point. When she'd discovered the man she was in love with, a senior manager at her place of work, was already engaged to someone else, she'd walked out on him and her job in one fell swoop. With no idea what to do next, she'd been grateful and relieved to find a job at the Three Feathers to tide her over. Jan had taken her under her wing and offered her as many shifts as she wanted, plus a good helping of moral support too. Now, being back in the convivial atmosphere of the pub, it was as though she'd never been away. It occurred to Ree that coming to work here was the start of her turning her life around. She'd been just beginning to get to know Luke better then, and together they'd joined the Primrose Fancies pub quiz team, along with Abby, Sam, Lizzie and Bill. Their unlikely friendship group had opened up a whole new social scene for them all. Happy times indeed.
You miss this place, don't you?
Luke's question jolted her out of her reverie. The pub? She looked across into his intense blue eyes, which always held the power to enthrall her. Yes, I suppose I do. It's so lovely seeing everyone again.
But more than just the pub, I mean living here. Having your support network of your friends and your mum around you. Being able to pop over to Primrose Woods whenever you want to.
Ree gazed at Luke across the table, wondering what he was getting at. Of course, but that's what makes it all the more special when we do get to come home. We'll be back for Christmas, and that's really not that far away. I was talking to Pia, and she was saying that this year's Christmas Carols event at the hall is going to be so much bigger this time around, with a traditional festive market. Ree's voice took on a dreamy quality. I can't wait to see it, because it was such a special evening last year, although Pia has said she can't guarantee the snow. Ree laughed at the memory. It had been so romantic, standing hand in hand with Luke in front of the hall, which had been lit up in a golden glow against the dark night sky, listening to the carolers' tuneful renditions fill the air. With the unexpected flurry of snow falling in soft swirling flakes around them, it had been a magical moment that was now etched on Ree's brain. Now Luke raised his eyebrows at her, tilting his head to one side as though inviting her to elaborate. Well, I mean, Dashford is lovely too. It was true. It was a beautiful town set on the river with a popular and thriving arts centre, a wide range of eclectic shops and a huge choice of bars and restaurants. But it was none of those things that had made the decision to move there such a simple one. Last Christmas, when Luke announced his plans to leave, to take up a new job 100 miles away from her, Ree was devastated. She couldn't tell Luke that, though. Their relationship had only recently turned into something more romantic, and she hadn't wanted to put any demands on him or appear needy. Ree was resigned to the fact that theirs was destined to be only a sweet holiday romance that they would both look back on with fondness. So when Luke had suggested that she go with him, and they moved into the riverside flat together, she couldn't have been more delighted. She realised what a special person Luke was, and hadn't wanted to risk losing him. She wanted to give their relationship a proper chance. Upping sticks and going with him was absolutely the right decision, and she hadn't regretted it for a moment.
Yes, but would you want to move back here if you could?
What? She paused, deciding to let her response slide, not wanting to dwell on it. Why are you even asking that?
It's been good to see you looking so happy this weekend, that's all. And when you talk about this place being home, I can hear the excitement in your voice and see the light in your eyes.
Yes, but I'm just as happy being with you in Dashford.
Sometimes I feel guilty for having dragged you away from here. It's okay for me, I get to go into the office a few times a week while you're stuck in the flat, looking at the four walls of the spare bedroom all day.
Ree had been working hard to get her virtual assistant business off the ground and had a good base of clients now. She might be a little isolated, but it was worth it, knowing Luke would be coming home to her at the end of the day. Ha! Ree snorted a laugh. You hardly dragged me. I came very willingly. Besides, I can always get outside and take a walk along the riverbank when I get stir-crazy. But the charms of the cutesy Cotswold village were very different to those of Primrose Woods. Dashford was pretty as a picture. The postcards of the meandering river and stone cottages sold in all the gift shops were testament to that fact. It was a buzzing, vibrant town, and often at the weekends it would be overrun with visitors. The beauty of Primrose Woods was something else entirely. The natural, rugged landscape covered several hundreds of acres, and you only had to walk a short distance along one of the myriad tracks to be alone amongst the stunning countryside, the only noises coming from the resident wildlife. Ree always found walking amongst the towering trees nurturing and energizing, helping to get her thoughts in order and providing a clearer perspective on anything that might be troubling her. She missed those regular visits to the woods with Abby, where they would put the world to rights, gossiping and laughing, before joining Lizzie in the cafe for one of her special daily sweet treats. Admittedly, her life had completely altered since moving to Dashford, but she'd been happy to embrace the change to be with Luke. They were happy together, and life had to move on. It couldn't stay the same forever.
You could always come back if you wanted to.
What? Alarm rose in Ree's chest as she jumped on Luke's words. And leave you in Dashford? No, that would never work. I'd miss you too much, and who knows how it would impact on our relationship. I can't believe you're even suggesting it. Luke laughed and reached a hand across the table, interlocking his fingers with hers.
I meant us both coming back. We could find somewhere to live around here.
But what about your job? Ree's forehead creased as she appraised Luke's expression, looking for hidden meaning, ignoring the bubble of excitement rising in her chest.
Well, I could work from home a couple of days a week. How long does the journey take? An hour and a half tops. That's not so bad if I was only doing it a few times a week.
What about the flat?
Short-term let until the end of the year. So, if we want to make a move, then now would be a good time to start looking.
Ree's gaze drifted around the bar, the swell of conversation and laughter enveloping her, making her feel a part of something much bigger. It wasn't often Ree was lost for words, but now was one of those times. She hadn't even considered moving back here, but now that Luke had put the idea into her head, she realised there was nothing she wanted more.
It's only an idea,
Luke said, releasing his hand and picking up his glass, fixing her with those lovely blue eyes, a half smile at the corner of his lips.
Have a think and see what you reckon.
Chapter 4.
Are you okay?
Pia had cleared the table and was loading the dishwasher before putting the pans in, placing his hands on her waist, his breath warm on her cheek. She turned, their lips meeting, his arms wrapping her in a strong embrace. When she came up for air, she smiled. I'm fine, she sighed.
Are you sure? It's just that over breakfast, you seemed a bit quiet and thoughtful. You're not upset about me teasing you over the wedding?
No, she said airily, wholly distracted by Jackson's proximity, the hardness of his body up against hers. I knew you were only joking.
Good, and don't let Ronnie get to you either. I know she can be a bit full-on at times when she gets a bee in her bonnet. You just need to let it all go over your head. That's what I do.
Pia had never been any good at hiding her feelings, but that seemed to be especially the case as far as Jackson was concerned. She would have to try harder at keeping her emotions under wraps so that he couldn't easily decipher her every thought. It was most unnerving how he had...